today I'm delighted to introduce Emma Marie Horridge, who's going to be talking to us about play-based learning. And I was talking to Emma earlier. Emma was saying there are some aspects of this that may lead on to another webinar that Emma will be leading in the new year. So we're really looking forward to the webinar today with Emma. Emma, I'd like to thank you so much for devoting your time to plan this webinar and to share your expertise with so many people. Following this webinar, ISAT will be providing everybody here today who is participating in the webinar a certificate of participation. So please keep this either as an electronic copy in your digital portfolio, or if you wish, you may print it off and frame it and put it on your wall. It's up to you. Thailand Ministry of Education, who's working with Kurusapa, who are in charge of issuing us all and renewing our teaching licenses, they will need to see evidence of professional development and CPD. So another aspect of these webinars is providing you with a certificate and evidence that you have taken part in valuable CPD, and you can use this towards renewing your teaching license and certification. So Emma, I'll hand over to you. Thank you to everybody for attending, and we look forward to Emma and the amazing things that she's going to be sharing with us. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Duncan, for a lovely introduction. Just a few bits of housewarming that ISAT have asked me to share with you. First of all, can I just mention that if your Zoom name is different to your actual name that you've registered with, can you please send that on chat to ISAT now so that they will add you as a certificate. So for example, I think I saw Zoom Kings earlier. If there are a number of you there, it's really important that you send your names through to ISAT so they know everybody who has participated in the event. Secondly, as Duncan mentioned, I'm running an event on assessment in early years in January, and as many of you know, as part of play-based learning, that's a really natural next step for us. So while we are asking for questions today, I may not get time to answer all of the questions you may have on assessment, but it definitely would help me to tailor make the webinar that I will do in January based on the things that you actually want to know. So please do use the chat function to ask any questions you may have about assessment, but also about any other questions. And if we have time at the end, I will also be sharing some of the answers to those if we have time at the end. A final thing that we just wanted to mention is that today's webinar is being recorded by ISAT, and they also have a copy of the PowerPoint presentation. So afterwards, they will send everything out. So please feel if you want to come back to anything, there will be a recording. So without any more waiting, I will share my screen now and start the presentation. Okay, share. Okay, so we're here today to talk about play-based learning. I'm Emma Marie Horridge, as Duncan let you know. I am currently the Deputy Head at Brighton College Pre-Prep. I previously worked for Brighton College in the Middle East as their Head of Early Years and Deputy Head of Primary School, and come from very much a play-based background. However, what I want to talk to you a little bit more about today is my own journey to play-based learning. I'm hoping that this may help some of you in your own journeys, because I think it's really about being reflective in our own practice and maybe thinking about what it is that we want to deliver, the quality of what we're delivering so far, and where we want to get to. And I'm also going to share some of the important things that I think have helped me and my teams that I've worked with in delivering what I now consider to be a really quality play-based education. And that includes thinking about the teacher, our interactions, and how we can progress a play-based learning curriculum into year 1 and beyond. So, first of all, my own personal beliefs was that play was a vehicle for learning. My husband often used to joke, I say joke, probably wasn't, that all I did was play all day. As many of you probably hear from our non-teaching friends, it's all we do, we play all day. But I always had a strong belief that play was learning and that it was really important. And when I was working within the EYFS, and I have taught from EYFS all the way up to year 6, so I have a really mixed experience, I really believed that I was delivering that play-based learning curriculum. Now, on reflection, looking back, lots of my own practice was about me planning play for the children. So I had planned topics every 6 weeks, which I'm sure is a model that many of you are familiar with, either you currently use or have used in the past. I believed that they met the needs of the unique child because I thought about the interests of what the children were interested in. We had positive relationships and I would play with them as part of this. And I created enabling environments that were really focused around their interest in these topics. And there was learning taking place. I always had really good reviews as a teacher. It was very tiring. There was a lot of work that went in to create that fantastic topic-based play. It was exhausting if we're really honest about it. One of the things that really connected with me when I went on this training was I suddenly realized, learning about Reggio inspired education, that it really was linked to the EYFS. Our model of learning is exactly what a Reggio inspired curriculum was, all about the unique child, following their interactions in the moment, having those positive relationships where we're respecting children, and the third teacher is our enabling environment. So that's where our learning can develop. And that really is a true play-based learning curriculum. And it made me begin to evaluate the type of play-based learning that I was delivering and whether it really was a play-based curriculum. And I started to do some further research. There's a fantastic quote here from Erica Christakis in The Importance of Being Little. And one of the things I came across here, that we need to be more interested in our goals of what we're looking for. Simply thinking about whether children can identify triangles and squares is something a dog can do, which when you start to look back at some of your play-based experiences, really made me question how I was interacting in that play, what I was planning and what I thought was a quality style education. And being reflective, I realized how much time I spent in play actually checklisting what children could do rather than being fully involved in play. Some of you maybe follow the curiosity approach. And again, a moment to maybe stop and reflect on our own practice. Here we have an example of what might be a very typical thing that many of us may have produced in the past or still do as part of our topics. Children love learning about Easter, so let's make a fantastic Easter craft. And when we're really reflective and we look back at some of the crafts that we're making, was there any play involved? Was it a play-based learning curriculum? Who is this type of activity for? Are we creating something where the child is really involved and actively playing, or are we giving them a colour by numbers type activity that we are doing to checklist again, something that anyone can do? It's not encouraging play. A nice Vygotsky quote here, looking at how the basic law of creativity, not in the product, but in the process. And that's a really big part of play that I really needed to evaluate for myself. I was looking at playing to produce something that I could tick off as the meeting in the EYFS curriculum, rather than focusing on having a play-based curriculum for the process of play. A slightly less daunting way of looking at this and not being quite so critical of my own practice at the time, I came across the National Association for Education of Young Children. And this was a rather nice diagram and way to look at it when we're evaluating our own practice. And it might be something that as a team you want to do over the next few weeks, just looking at your own interactions and how much time children are spending in one of these 4 boxes. So how much time do they have for free play, where they're really active and you are stepping back? How much time are you involved in the play, helping to scaffold the play? And how much time Are you actually making the child be a passive member of that, where you're giving instructions and rules and directing the play? And obviously, are you allowing some time for some rest as well in between? And when I looked at it, I realized I was allowing actually quite a lot of time for their free play, but I was often so involved in the directed instruction rule-based games, as well as really observing the children, that I was running out of time to really reflect and take part in that free play that's so important. Hopefully, by using other schemes, we can realize how important that free play is. Now, the Leuven scales was something that I was aware of, but again, hadn't spent too much time on. Now, the Leuven scales of involvement, if you are doing anything with play, are really, really important, because involvement is about concentration, being totally focused on something, wanting to get that contact with the reality around you. And that's what creates the motivation and fascination. And that's what we really want to see when children are in play. I heard it described once as that tongue stuck out moment. When we see children in play and we talk about play-based learning, that's what we want to see, those tongues stuck out, fascinated, awe and wonder of the world. There's a lovely story that I heard as part of my Reggio inspired practice about a child who created a brown spot every day. And their parent was really disturbed. They were an artist, and every day their child was coming home with a brown splotch. So they go to the school and they say, you know, what is this? What is he learning? He's just coming, he's playing all day, he's not learning anything. And the teachers were able to explain that actually this was a fantastic process of learning. They'd been observing him, and he was really interested in colour and painting. And so every day he was lining up all of the colours, and he was painting and mixing the colours. And then he was trying to turn it back to the original colour. And each day he was methodically coming along, and he was changing the order of the colours to see if the order that he mixed the colours would change if he could get back to the original colour. And I think that's a really prime example of how informative play can be to a child, the problem solving, the direction it can take them, and the learning that can be taking place. And because those teachers were giving time to free play and not interfering and not simply directing rules-based of how colours mix, that child is going to learn so much more. Similarly, there's lots of research about children learning how to use remote control toys. We can say we have a play-based learning where one group of children are learning to play with Bee-Bots, but the teacher directs them in how to play. And reflecting on my own practice, that would have been me in my previous practice. I would have given them rules about how to play with the Bee-Bots and then let them play. They will meet our learning objectives in that way, but the child isn't very active. However, if we give them the Bee-Bots and give them time, they will learn how to use the Bee-Bots, but they will also make mistakes, as in that Reggio video. They will learn that it's okay to make mistakes and they have to be resilient and try again and get things wrong. And they will learn to work with their peers and find out from their friends how to do something by watching others. And it's really that understanding of what creates that high quality, active child-based play with high levels of involvement on the Leuven scale that will really help move our play-based learning forward. So for some of you, you may be in that situation where I was previously, and hopefully this will help you to reflect on some of your previous practice. Or for some of you, maybe it's a justification in some of the beliefs you have and really pushing forward that type of involved, child-led, play-based learning. I'm going to move on now to talking about the things that when we initiated this in our play-based learning that were essential to make sure there was quality level of involvement and really high levels of progress and learning taking place. Now, the first thing that's really important is the environment. whether we're thinking about that in terms of enabling environment from the EYFS curriculum or any other curriculum that you use. I will always refer back to EYFS as that is my background and where I come from, but many of these things are transferable to any of the early years curriculums provided. Or if you're talking about the third teacher from a Reggio inspired standpoint. Now, I use some terminology today that I have seen used by different people in many different ways. And when you're reading, I think it's really important that you just think about what sort of environment they're talking about. And within your own setting, whether it's between you and a TLA or whether it's between you and a group of teachers, that you decide on that shared framework of language, because there are many different elements to the environment. And it's really important that when you're evaluating your practice and you're setting up for play, that you're agreeing on what that terminology is. And that was a big part of the provision that I put in place in both Brighton College in the Middle East and in the UAE. So I'm going to talk a little bit, first of all, about what I believe continuous provision is and why it's so important within early years and beyond. So continuous provision is not something that changes all the time. And quite often when I've spoken to people, they talk about having continuous provision in their classroom, and it's something that they change weekly for the children to come in and do. I think it's really important that when we talk about continuous provision, or whatever element you want to call this, that these are things that the children can access all the time. It may change on intervals, half-termly or termly, depending on the needs of the children. But overall, the children know where to get things, where it will be, and that they are allowed to access this as much as possible to enhance their own learning wherever they are. So they know that they can take things from here and move it to where it needs to be. We often talk about enhancing these areas, because if you set up a continuous provision area and it has these wonderful resources with numbers that are really going to support the children, maybe you have tape measures in there, going to encourage them to be using some measuring, but no one's ever using it, then it's a real waste of time. If we want to have valuable play-based learning, we need to ensure that the children are using the resources that are going to drive their learning forwards. So first of all, it's really important that you allow time on your planning to not just observe the children, but also to observe the areas of learning. Where are they using? Where is talk taking place? Where are you seeing those high levels of involvement, and where are you maybe seeing things not being looked after, being a little bit trashed? One of the things that I really encourage our staff to do as part of a half-termly planning meeting is reflect on this and think about how they maybe can enhance an area of learning to encourage children to go along and use some of those familiar items. The picture on the right of the screen, or maybe the left of your screen, I'm not sure if it's mirroring, you can see that the loose parts area, for example, the children had recently been interested in Halloween. Now they were thinking about seeds. So we were just trying to draw them over to this loose parts area that they hadn't been using that much. And we really wanted them to be exploring these loose parts for building up their numeracy and also for developing patterns, etc. So we're trying to draw them into some of those areas that maybe have not been so frequently used. Now, the second area, I'm going to go on to talk about Anna Ethgrave later on, and some of you maybe have done some of that training. Different people who talk about play-based learning have different beliefs with this, but I do feel that having provocations or invitations can really encourage excellent levels of play and progress. Now, again, we use this terminology maybe differently to you, and as long as you've agreed on that, but very much when we talk about provocations, we talk about open-ended opportunities for children to play. So we just add something to an area to encourage them to explore. So for example, with the seeds area, there wasn't a direct instruction of what the children needed to do. They could create anything in this area that they wanted. But sometimes we want to move a particular piece of learning forward. So we would set up an actual invitation. We're telling the children what to do. I think it's really important as part of play-based learning that we really think about our youngest children, our pre-nursery children or playgroup children, having as much opportunity with continuous provision and provocations with very few invitations, and really follow their leads. But as we move up into reception, into year 1 and beyond, we may have more invitations where we're encouraging the children to do a certain thing, where we're helping to drive that learning forward through the environment that we're setting up. One thing that's really good to look at is within your environment, have you just set up all invitations? Are you telling the children what it is that you want them to be doing? The chances are it doesn't matter if you are, but what you might find if you reflect on your practice is that they're not doing any of that anyway. So while you're spending time setting up an invitation and asking them to complete this particular activity, if they're not going to naturally do it without you pulling them to it, and therefore perhaps interrupting that high level of learning that we saw when we think about those Leuven scales, then what is the point in spending all of your time creating that invitation? It could be far more important to allow for some free space where they can collect the continued provision and create their own play. So it's really important that we allow time to evaluate those areas of our learning, think about what's there, why it's there, and whether learning is happening without us interrupting play to pull children to it. Where I went along completely unexpectedly, and you can just see that all the children, as I was walking around, were playing and involved, and we didn't need to do anything with them other than have the environment set up. And some of the children were at a provocation that the teacher had created, and lots of the children were busy playing with things that are there all the time. And they were all learning without us having that high level of involvement. They were driving their own learning forwards. They were creating their own play. And as long as we have an environment that facilitates that, we just have to trust that the children will be learning and that they will create those fascinations. And often I think we have this fear of children doing these other things and it being wild, and it's just not. They will show high levels of involvement if you create the environment to facilitate that. But I do think there are some top tips that we can share when it comes to creating an environment that makes that really good. Now, one of the things that many of you may know about is the transporting schema, and it's a really important part of children's development, but is also probably one of the hardest things to deal with as a teacher when you believe in play-based learning, and suddenly the children move everything to another place to create their play. And as wonderful as that play may be, it can be a nightmare for you. So I think it's really important when we talk about play-based learning to think about those established rules that we can create with the children. For example, I have a space there where there's water play with sand trucks that have been in the sand trays and are now in the water trays. And it's always one of the things when we go to different schools where certain schools go, oh, it's a nightmare. Now they're mixing the sand and water and it's created this mess. But actually that mess is fabulous learning. But if you want to have them using certain things in certain spaces, make sure they know that there is an area in water where they can have that mixing, where they can do that cleaning. If they know where that is, they will follow those rules. The other possibly most important element that you can have is really making sure that your resources are open to the children. If the resources are open to the children and they know how to access them and how to put them away, they will transport those things back if that's an established routine within your classroom. Lots of big boxes with lots of labels can be intimidating, can just make it too much, that they can't see the resources, they don't use them. But if you have them open, they will use them. Now, shadowing was one of the things that I learned from the Anna F. training that really made a massive difference in being able to facilitate play. Because at the end of the day, everything is in the wrong place. It's really hard to have that going day to day. But if you set that shadowing up, then the children are going to be far more independent and you can continue to have those options available. Another thing I wanted to talk about briefly was really taking advantage of nature. So here I've got some photos shared from different environments. This is back from in the Middle East. Obviously, nature means that we can have children out playing outside as much as possible and taking advantage of things that are there. We very much plan our outside areas in the same way. We make sure there are some items that are always available in terms of continuous provision. So if we want the children to be able to play with the garden, we make sure that there's always some seeds available, there's always watering cans, they have access to the water and the trowels, that they know the importance of washing their hands afterwards, that we have areas for construction outside, that we have areas for physical development, that they know where to get the planks, where to put the planks away, and that's very much part of the learning. And often we'll try and enhance or create a provocation outside to move the learning forwards, particularly if we have certain children who will always spend all their time outside. There is no need to be pulling children inside to come to your provocations of learning inside for your play-based learning and disrupting their play if they want to be outside. You can set up your provocations to move their learning forward, or an invitation to move their learning forward where they are. So again, by spending that time for your observations to watch the children and what it is that they're using and where it is, not only can you use that to try and encourage them to come to certain areas that you think may help their learning develop, but it's really important that you take that learning to where the children are, that you set up play-based opportunities to enhance their learning there. One of the big things that we have spoken about is really in allowing for this play-based education to take place outside and not with indoor equipment. One of the things that I think one of my top tips was really to allow time. I was one of those people who very much came from, one of my first backgrounds was all of the deputy heads, for example, were from a higher level of education, top of Key Stage 2, and they wanted to see planning. If you're in an environment where that's not asked for so much, that's fantastic. But if you do have to produce that planning in that way, be prepared to show on there time for observing the areas, time for observing the children, but also allow time for children to return to things. If you're constantly facilitating the play and changing things, then children don't have time to go back and get them right. If we're following that Reggio inspired model of letting children make mistakes, you have to let children go back to things. You can't keep changing them. So be really mindful. Someone might not be using that area today, but they may well come back to it tomorrow. So really think about how long you leave something somewhere and the environment you're creating. Another thing I really wanted to mention is really don't pull children away from their play. Try not to interrupt high levels of involvement. If you're prepared to allow time, you don't need all of the children to have planted a seed today. That's not what they need to be able to do for their next stages of development. But if you leave that there, the chances are they will all go and have a go at something if it's there for a long enough period of time. Whereas if you're moving it on too quickly, then they're not going to have those opportunities. And again, just coming back to trust, just believe that they are learning, trust that they are learning, and be prepared to take that time and that step back. Now, another area I just wanted to mention, I spoke about how I attended the Reggio Inspired training, and it led to really researching more about my own practice. Many of you who are nursery practitioners will have come across the Curiosity approach as somewhere to magpie ideas online through Instagram or Facebook. They really are a really good area if you're interested in creating interesting invitations and provocations to encourage that level of learning. They feed from Reggio inspired play, they also feed from Steiner and different approaches, and are just again creating their own vision of what they think this should look like. They provide lots of training opportunities if you want to feed in online. I have taken part in Alain, we did the accreditation. I think it's very much about deciding whether it suits your environment or not, but you can definitely dip into lots of the training that they do. One of my favorite things to share is really their approach to creating a play-based learning that reflects positively on the environment. So At Brighton, we're a very eco-friendly school. Our lead practitioner in the secondary school is really trying to drive our eco approach forwards. And it's something we're keen to do within EYFS too. And one of the ways we can do this is to move away from the plastic. So if you are a school that obviously already has a lot of plastic resourcing, then we're obviously going to continue that. But when you're making your next purchase, really think about whether it's necessary. So for example, plastic, Legos, stick or bricks, connects. Can we create that exact same learning through play if we have loose parts, wood, second-hand materials? In fact, is there more problem solving involved with these sorts of materials where everything, quite frankly, might go wrong? A fantastic example of something that I really moved away from was plastic tea sets. Get real china and the children will break it. And it's a really fantastic opportunity because the children will learn how to handle your resources. Whereas if you have plastic, they will throw them and destroy them. Whereas learning how to pour real tea, real coffee with real resources is obviously something that will benefit them and change their approaches to how they use things, and a fantastic opportunity for physical development in our early years children. Another approach that was really fantastic with using the Curiosity approach, they do lots of work on working with their parents to gather resources that they don't have in that element of reusing. Now, many of you, like myself, work at premium schools. So we obviously don't want to ask parents for resources that we can buy ourselves. But for those of you perhaps who are in a school where purchasing those resources may be difficult, there are lots of things that your parents may have at home that would be fantastic for enhancing your environments and play-based areas at school. In the UAE, for example, our parents donated the most beautiful Arabic coffee pots, which was a fantastic way of getting their culture into their play-based learning. The children really enjoyed it, and it was an opportunity to respect and reflect on that in a different way, and also reusing things that would have otherwise been thrown away. And now that we've got the environment set up, I wanted to really come back and think about, well, what is it that we do when we're not observing? So we've done our observations and now we're teaching. It's really important, if we're going to say that we are play-based learning, that we aren't spending all of our teaching time in front of a classroom and then planning activities where we call children to us. It's really important that we allow time for us just to get involved in play. I'm going to call them interactions. I've mentioned that I've done some of the Anna F-Grove training. Some of you may be similar. And this is a really excellent way of helping you to interact and play with children rather than teach children. So for many of you, you'll already be familiar with the fact that scaffolding learning comes from Vygotsky, with this idea that what a child can do today with assistance, they'll be able to do tomorrow. I will reflect back to how we have to be careful with this when we are scaffolding. We have to really make sure that we know when to step in, because if we're constantly scaffolding that play, we're also stealing those opportunities for children to learn it for themselves. So we have to constantly be making these mindful decisions. Vygotsky calls this knowing the appropriate moment to intervene in that zone of proximal development. So knowing when is it right to step in. The next thing with this is also really being aware, not only of when is it right to step in, but making sure we're stepping in to move learning forwards. There really is no pointing us, other than a nice relationship with the child, to join in with a child's play and just keep it at the level that it's at. If we are interacting with a child, if we're joining in with a child's play, it should be because we are able to move that learning forward to help them make progress through that interaction. Now, this very much again fits into EYFS, in the moment planning. We are seeing what the child is doing, we're assessing where they're at, whether they're moving their own learning forward, and then we're planning in that moment, can we step in, what can we do to help them move forward? I'll talk to you then just a little bit about the teacher. So this is a teacher from one of the schools where Anna F. Grave used to be the assistant head, and it uses the model that she talks about in her books for interactions. And the interactions are all about watching the children play, allowing them opportunities to play, and picking that optimal moment for when there is a teachable moment and stepping in for that interaction. So those interactions can be as simple as a child not being able to do up their coat. You watch them, they can't figure it out, and you stepping in and you either model how to do the coat, you might explain how to do up their coat, and help them to then make that next step in their learning so they can now do up their coat. Obviously, there may be longer interactions, which may be based on a project for the day, but it's this idea that the interactions are happening, and this understanding that there may be thousands of interactions that are taking place across a day, and we obviously won't document all of them, but we have an understanding of when they're moving that learning forward, that we're constantly reflecting on what that next moment then for that child would be. So some Anna F. Grave tips of how to have really high quality play-based learning. Make sure you are going to the children's level. So you are going down and you are playing with them wherever they are. You watch, listen, wait, and wait, and wait. We have a real tendency to jump in and really be prepared to observe, watch, and then just move away. Some more drawing going on the screen. Be prepared to move away and let them carry on if the learning is taking place without you. Only interact when there is a teachable moment. And the next step with this is to try and not just question them, because questioning is taking away often from the play. If you think about your own, something that you want to do where you're playing something, if someone's constantly asking you questions, that's not playing. And we need to make sure that if we're playing with them, we're moving their learning forwards without constantly questioning them. So what sort of things might we do instead of questioning? We can model language, we can show, suggest, provide resources, explain, demonstrate, explore ideas, encourage, remind, narrate what they're doing. I'm going to come back to that a little bit in a moment. Facilitate, set challenges, but my favorite one is ponder. So when I have an urge to ask a question, I might say, I wonder, and move it forward in that way. I've got a nice example. When I made the video that I shared with you earlier, there were some, or that you didn't see, there were some children who were making a train track, and they were really stuck on making two pieces fit. So I used the language, I wonder what would happen if we used a curved piece. So then that just helps them to go and find that curved piece and try it out. And it just helps you to facilitate that next step without saying, find a curved piece. Now, if they chose to ignore me, by not making it a question or a direction, it doesn't matter, because I can tell they're involved in what they're doing and they've already got their own strategy. It's not the right time for me to interact. But by pondering something out loud, it might just give them that clue that if they want to facilitate that, they can find it, they can move that forwards, and it's going to help them make that next step. Narrating play is something that I feel I got a lot better at after doing some training with helicopter stories. Some of you, again, may have used this. For those of you who haven't, helicopter stories are essentially where you follow children in their play and you write down what they're doing. I don't know if anyone else has experienced this, but I found that lots of my children in free play would constantly play games where several of the children are dogs and they have to crawl along the floor and try and feed each other. And it's a very strange area to observe and watch and go, what is it they're doing? By taking those helicopter stories, I was able to go along and start narrating their play and writing down what they were doing. I was using their language, but I would often read it back, and it was a real opportunity to model the correct language as I read back. So I have my notes for me with what I've written down of where their language is at. But when I read it back to them, I'm modeling correct language. It would be a real opportunity for the children to then actually start to move that play forwards into more of a role play. And you can use that helicopter story for them to model their play at the end of the day or at the end of a session, where they can read the story and share it to other people. Sometimes you can use it for them to actually start writing their own play. They may take your clipboards and start narrating some of their own ideas. But one of the areas I've also found it particularly useful, being in another country, is where lots of the children will be playing using their native language. And we want to encourage them to play in English as much as possible. But sometimes it's hard if we don't know what they're interested in or where they're playing and why they're playing there. One of my TLAs in the Middle East was able to watch a group of boys that I thought were having quite low-level play. And I found out that they were actually completely role modeling their father's play of being in a coffee house, and they were having really quite in-depth conversations, repeating some of the things they'd been learning. And now that I knew what that play was, I was able to interact with them and move it forwards. So it's a really great opportunity to understand the play and help that play move forwards. And perhaps for some of those shy children, to encourage them to take part in something in front of the rest of the class. Now, this is a quote from Ofsted that I think is particularly useful if anybody is in a setting where perhaps you're being observed by members of the team who are maybe not used to a play-based learning environment. And this is from Ofsted that says that teaching is not always a top-down model. So teaching is child-initiated play and activities where we see communicating, modeling language, showing, explaining, demonstrating, exploring ideas, all those things we've just spoken about. So it's a real opportunity for, if you need to justify how your play-based learning and your interactions is actually top-notch quality education. So I've spoken a lot now about play-based learning, and I thought it was really important to think about how play-based learning is not just about EYFS, but also about year one and indeed beyond. An interesting fact that I found just a couple of years ago, in the UK, children used to begin education at 5 to 12 years. We obviously now have reception as well. But actually, before the 1870 Education Act, there was lots of research that was done on when children are best to start education. And the research found, even back in the 19th century, that the best time to start education was that grade 1, year 2 year, when children are 6 turning 7, that they start their formal education in Europe and America. And the only reason in Britain that we began at age 5 was because parents wanted their children back so they could go out and work in factories. So the fact that we have that still as our basis for starting formal education can be quite a shocking revelation when we're thinking about how we're framing our year 1 learning. Some lovely quotes here from Sir Ken Robinson about how our schools are still modelled on that Victorian base where we needed to produce children that could go and work in factories. Sugata Mitra talks about how it was a great system for them, but it's not the right system if we're thinking about our new 18-year-olds who are going into a world that is completely different. So we really have to make sure that we're thinking about what's the best stage of development for our children. And when we take that into consideration, we really have to recognise that year 1 fits very much in with this early years model, and that children from 2 to 7 are very much on this stage of development where play-based learning, that problem solving, is so essential. And I've got some examples here of some studies that were done both in the UK and in New Zealand, where that earlier start for formal education doesn't have positive benefits in the long run and can have damaging benefits. So when we are in a system where we're going to be having children in education with us earlier on, we've got to ensure that we have that play-based environment, and making sure we extend it is important. And having mentioned all of those, some of the things that I've spoken about today are very much designed for all of Key Stage 1 too. Anna F. Grave has a fantastic training book called Year 1 in Action. I think, again, Anna F. Grave on her training talks about the importance of using these as a guide and picking out what's the vision for your school. And I do think that's important, particularly in international environments where we have lots of specialists. You can't follow this scheme exactly, but you can use it to help influence and ensure you have lots of opportunities. And helicopter stories, again, are completely designed to be for EYFS and into Key Stage 1. Alistair Bryce Clegg's blog, ABC Does, is another amazing resource for people in Year 1 and above. There are lots of schools in the UK that are really working on continuing provision into Year 1, and there are some great opportunities to read up on blogs in there. The key things that I wanted to pick out were from one of the blogs from St John's C of E School that we've tried to keep as part of our use of continuous provision, is thinking about which elements of play can we take away from the curriculum to allow time. Because one of the things that we constantly get back from people is there's no time to play when you get into Key Stage 1. But actually, children can learn lots of the curriculum, like measure, shape, time, money. I know I'm picking lots of maths examples there, but there are lots in the other areas too, through play. So if we allow time for play and we continue our model of having a opportunity for children to explore and play, and trusting that learn will happen if we create that right environment with continuous provision, provocations, and now more invitations because they're older, we know to trust that the children will have those levels of play. And several of our schemes of work really support this. So I've got an example here for the White Rose scheme of work. And the White Rose scheme of work uses a concrete, pictorial and abstract model in the formal teaching of maths from Year 1 upwards. And so one of the things that we really promote is ensuring that those concrete materials that the children are using are always available for play. So if the children have dice and tens frames and Numicon and tape measures as part of their CPA approach in their formal maths, make sure it's a part of your continuous provision so they continue to learn and have those opportunities in their play. You know, don't teach about money in class, go to the shop and let children buy things at the shop. I did have a video here, again, apologies it's not playing. One of our children, they're doing a science experiment in Year 3, and they were playing with the magnets as part of their experiment. And after that, we have an area for continuous provision within even the Year 3 areas, and they are allowed to go and play with all of those resources throughout that topic, all the way into Key Stage 2. So I'm very aware that I'm coming up to the end of the hour. So just a few things, takeaways from the day. If you really want to have a play-based learning in your setting, you've really got to think about your timetable. What must be adult-led? We still teach phonics, we still teach formal maths for a very small period of time in the early years and longer in Key Stage 1. But what can you take away to allow for that time? Make sure you're scheduling time to observe for the environment and for the children, and make sure you're having that time to talk to your colleagues. And make sure you have an environment that facilitates that play, that the children know how to use it, that they have resources that will help them to learn, that will lead to high levels of involvement on the Leaving scales. And now, questions and answers. Oh, sorry. Just come out of the meeting. Have recommendations for an outdoor playground. I've only been in Thailand for 1 year, so local connections in terms of outside playgrounds, personally, I might not have the best, but the team here do have lots of connections, so I'm happy to share that for people to go away with. One of the things that I would really advise though is purchase pallets, planks, get old tyres and actually create physical development that the children can create and move themselves. So an actual playground that has wonderful slides, swings, etc. is obviously lovely, looks good, and the children will develop from that. But even ladders across 2 tyres is going to be full of play from the children. They will love it, they will spend hours, and is really going to help develop their physical development. So the more things that you can actually get that the children can transport and create themselves in those large loose parts, the better really. And again, you can then set up the continuous provision, how you want them to use it. So make sure you've got shadowing of where those planks need to go back to. If your tyres are fixed or not fixed, we had some really big tyres donated in our lane that the children weren't allowed to move, but here we have some smaller tyres that the children can move themselves. So it's something that you need to agree on, but you can get lots of these things cheaply or for free if possible. Sorry, trying to see if there's any more questions there. I think most of the chat, from what I can see, I thought, okay, what do you think of plan, do, review and pulling children out of play for daily reading? So for our reading, we use a read, write, ink scheme from reception upwards. We don't do this in nursery or below, and obviously year 1 have read, write, ink. We try and always schedule read, write, ink first thing in the morning so that it's before the children are playing, so we're not pulling them out of playing for reading. Interventions after that, where we may have phonics cards, where we want to target certain children, it's all about looking for when they're not involved. So when they're not involved and there's that dip in their levels of involvement, go and talk to them about their read, write, ink cards. If they're involved in high levels of learning, then don't pull them out for that reading. It's not the right time. Wherever possible, we try and not pull children away when there's high levels of learning, high levels of involvement. In the very same way, we might teach a 10-minute set formal maths plan, but we don't schedule it on the timetable as happening at a certain time within our early years. Instead, we would look for that lull in learning and when the involvement's really dipped. So if suddenly there isn't anything going on, everyone's just kind of moving around, but not deep concentration, that's when we might stop, introduce the maths concept, and then let them get back. Now we've pulled that back in and maybe moved a few things to the right place. So a question here about resources in COVID. We are really lucky in Brighton that we have lots of cleaners who help us enormously facilitate our continuous provision and do help with sterilising lots of our equipment on a regular basis. But lots of the work that I've been doing, I've been trying to communicate with the UK with the Curiosity approach and see what they're doing. Lots of what they're saying is that they're going to keep all of their provision in place. They'll clean it regularly where possible, involve the children in cleaning resources before at the end of the day, which they love, but also just ensuring you have lots of hand washing times so that they use the equipment, they wash their hands, they use their equipment, they wash their hands. So you keep that process up. When we first came back after COVID, we did take away lots of the equipment and sand and things like this. But what we realized was we really had to manage risk versus reward, and the learning that takes place from our environment actually became more important because we didn't have that high level risk at that time. And if we didn't provide the continuous provision, actually the children were touching each other more, so they would still spread disease. They had more physical play with each other when we didn't have things for them to interact with. I'm really sorry if I'm missing any of these questions here. How can we encourage younger children to speak English when they do not have the vocabulary for it yet? I don't use flashcards other than read, writing for phonics. The language comes all from those interactions. So your TLAs, if they speak the same language of the children, can be really helpful in translating for you. So the training that we've done with our assistants who are native speakers has all been about them listening to the children, what they're saying in Thai, and repeating it back in English. So anytime they're playing with the children and they're interacting, anything the child says, they just repeat it back in English, continually, all the time, modeling that language. And we're exactly the same. If they're saying it in English but not quite correct, we never correct them, but we'll just go, oh, so you're playing with the Batman, that's interesting, and just repeat it back in a way that's not you mean, and get them to correct. Obviously, we can pick up on maybe areas of English that we can then use. We might read a story that might support language we've heard. Again, reading stories every day. I would encourage you to help them learn English more, perhaps through a Talk for Writing scheme, where you do lots of reading nursery rhymes and bringing that into their play, rather than just flashcard words. Possibly a slightly better way than flashcards is actually using Makaton. And if your TLAs can use a Makaton symbol, so it's like sign language. And so they may say water in Thai and you say water in English, and you use the same symbols. Thank you. That will help that you're consistently using those symbols, but that does involve, obviously, everyone involved to have some training with that. You can get lots of that online for free again. So there's a question here. What is the difference between helicopter learning and round robin cooperative learning? I'm not sure. The helicopter learning I'm talking about is very much about stories. When we say helicopter, it's just us being a helicopter and watching what's happening and picking up on that and narrating that through writing. Round robin learning, where they're going to different areas, I presume. We do that more with that type of play when they get into older key stage 1. And that's where you're sort of facilitating that higher level of, they're now ready for more adult direction. So it's just choosing that moment of when you want that to come in. So there's a long question here. It just says, when you spoke about transporting and children playing and mixing materials from different area centres, would you say that it's better to allow them to mix and then put things back later, or set the restrictive rule so they can't mix the materials? So, for example, my children's mix building blocks with the role play kitchen area because they like to pretend and cook the blocks. I separated the materials, this play would not occur. So my personal opinion is we should let them transport. That's a really important schema. But I think it's about knowing the restrictions. So the understanding that if we take something from here, we put it back. They won't always do it. But if we set those ideas up with the children from the beginning, if it's something that's going to ruin somebody else's play, then that's where it's important that we facilitate that in a different way. So the example I was trying to give was water play and sand play. If you've got a really fantastic water play, the video that didn't play was a very small clip of children who had tubes in the water, and there were water beads, and they were watching how they went down, which is really fantastic physics play. If children started to mix the sand into that water, it would spoil the learning the other people were taking part in. It would damage learning for other children. So where we know children love to mix sand and water, but they also like clean water play, we facilitate by having an area where they can mix sand and water in a different tray, and then a tray where we say we don't mix sand and water here. So therefore it's really fair to say to somebody that does mix the sand there, that's not where we do that over here. So it's about sort of setting up some of those rules that will help to take part in that. I know, yeah, and I'm always the same on knowing when to restrict that part. For example, when you have Play-Doh and they want to take the Play-Doh and then it ruins your beautiful kitchen, I think you have to set up those personal preferences, but wherever you can, transporting is a schema. So we do have to allow for that play to happen. Yeah, so one of the questions here is how to provide uninterrupted free play when you have a very short time. We have specialist lessons to go to each day. Definitely the same thing. Now, again, it depends on your position within a school. So when I went to the Middle East, our nursery children, our FS1, originally they had all their specialists were kind of all over the place. We worked really hard to move their specialists to later in the day, and the morning was sort of that uninterrupted playtime. Now, if you're a classroom teacher, you don't always have the opportunity to have a decision-making process in that. But one of the ways that we try to facilitate that where it's not possible is by having our specialists come to the children. And again, it's something you might want to talk to people about who design that part of the curriculum. So, for example, our music teacher comes to nursery and comes to the children in pre-nursery. And if the children are involved in high levels of play, we don't stop them to come and take part in music. We let that play continue. So that's something where the children still have an opportunity for that specialist teacher, but we're not going to interrupt their play. Then later on, the music teacher can very much do exactly what we do and go and interact with them in that area and maybe sing some songs, maybe create, if they're in the mud kitchen, we might suddenly have a mud band. But that's really about, one, looking at the timetable if you can, and two, can your specialists work in a way that doesn't interrupt the play? On the day of the video that I showed, I didn't include it because I was just looking at a few of the clips where the children were on their own without an adult, but you would have seen the Mandarin teacher was outside with those children. The children were playing in the water and the ice, so she's speaking to them in Mandarin in the water and the ice. So the other children who were playing didn't have to stop. She went to the children where they were. So if you can get your specialists on board, then that will really help. Obviously, swimming, you have to stop and tidy up and go to swim. And there will be times like that in the day. And I've mentioned with reception, we did it the other way around, where we tried to make sure that Read Write Ink was really in the morning, and some of our specialists earlier in the day. And then the uninterrupted play was in the afternoon. So that's how we managed our timetable. How does it compare to direct instruction? Recommendations for a specific altered time which children can play every day. So the direct instruction, I tried to talk a little bit at the start for the model from the research, which basically shows that with direct instruction, children will still learn. Children will learn with direct instruction. The difference is they won't develop their problem solving skills, and they won't develop their creativity skills or their teamwork skills. And those elements, when we look at that child development of those important years for 2 to 7, if we're doing the direct teacher instructed play, we'll see quick results. But when we're looking at those children when they're, say, age 10, there may be more negative impact on their long-term learning because they don't have some of those problem-based skills. And as a teacher who has taught in early years and year 4 and year 5, I can see the real difference in some of those children when it comes to their story writing, for example. Something I'm really keen on following up is our children who've had a real strong play-based learning and their ability to continue with problem solving further up in the school. So, allowing time for free-based play is really important. We don't have a specific allotted time for play-based learning. We tend to say that play-based learning is happening all of the time, and then we schedule in the teacher-led learning as and when it's needed. So the play-based learning is the first step. Yeah, so a really good question. If you don't have any staff who speak the children's language, now your settings may be similar to mine. We have a large number of children who speak Mandarin, Japanese, Eastern European languages, and it was similar when I was in the UAE. What I've always found with EAL is if you're the odd one out, you'll pick up English quicker because you have a need to speak the language that's the communal language. So if you have a school where there's lots of different languages, actually the child just being immersed in English will really help them to pick up English. But if you have a child where there's 50% of the children speaking the same language as them and they're playing, well, they're going to speak in their native language because there's no need for them to try and use English as a communal language. So obviously it's not ideal, and in an ideal world, we could have a TLA who speaks every language that we have in the school, but that would be really tricky. one thing that we got a great tip for last year, we had a Mandarin pupil in the early years, and we did need to communicate some things with him. We used Google Translate for some keywords to help us, and we used them with Makaton for just basic things like toilets and water, and we probably said really badly some of those keywords, but you can't observe their play in their native language in the same way. But most of the time they will convert to English to try and play along with other children. Yeah, when is a good time to step in when children are fighting over a toy? I think you just have to really look for what that level of aggression is. In the EYFS curriculum, coming to that compromise is, a reception age target. So we have to let them have some time. If you ever feel health and safety trumps everything, overlearning. So if it's fighting where it could be violent and one of the children isn't safe, always intervene. That's paramount. Health and safety first above everything else. If it's a disagreement, I think very much you have to look in the same way you would as any interaction. So watch, and are they going to learn from this argument? And if they are learning by one of them doing something, then let them come to that compromise themselves. Watch it, keep an eye on it, but let them come to that compromise because it's a learning moment. If they're not able to compromise yet, and often nursery children or younger won't be able to compromise yet, then that is a teachable moment. So that's when, in that Anna F. Grave model, you would step in and you might suggest, why don't we share the toy and think about having this and this? Or, oh, could you play with? And that's your teachable moment, giving them an idea and teaching them how to compromise. So it's really making that decision. Can they learn for themselves, or is it a teachable moment? And only you can judge that at the time. But as I said, if it's recommended for violence, step straight in. For anything that you have mentioned. So yes, the Curiosity approach, doing lots of, I'm really conscious of time, by the way, so if anyone wants to leave, please do, but I don't want to leave the questions. There are lots of training available online. At the moment, they're doing pocket-sized courses, and they're about £11 each. And you purchase into them, and then there's some small lessons. And there's a lovely one on invitations that we're just taking up. So you can find that online. So it's from the UK, but you can do it over here. The Anna F. Grave training, she has come over to Bangkok and done training over here before. But obviously, with COVID, it might not be the right time. But the books are really good, and if you purchase them on Book Depository, they will come over to us, and obviously you can read through. It explains the ideas, how they do them. The big takeaway from Anna F. Grave is using that to create a vision for your own school. You can't just take it as a like-for-like model. But for earlier years, there is actually a new book which is interacting with 2- and 3-year-olds, which I haven't read yet. But we want to get for our pre-nursery, and they normally have a sort of month-by-month guide, which can be really helpful in helping you to evaluate your own practice. She was doing, her courses were all turning to online webinars. However, it was UK timing. So if you're prepared to stay up to 2 o'clock in the morning, the Anna F. Grave training wasn't too expensive, but you might not want to work till that time at night. So if you look up the Anna F. Grave training, though, it should come up. And I think that was advertised on Facebook. Ooh. What is the ideal number of students per group to achieve the desired and better result via play-based learning? Now, I'm working in international settings where, we're very lucky to have small class numbers. If you watch the Anna F. Grave video that I was sharing, they're from a UK-based setting of nursery where there were 70 children within their nursery, all interacting at different times. And they had different staff who would go to different children. So you can do this with very big numbers. You can do it with very small numbers. The real key there is everyone understanding, obviously, who those children are, setting up a scheme possibly for focused children and going to observe those children. Even if you have one child, you can still let them play, but obviously you may need to act as a play buddy more often than a larger setting, because a lot of what they will learn is through those interactions with those peers. So you do want to have enough children that they can interact in small groups. Yeah, someone here has just put that they believe mimicking a body language will help with the language barrier. Definitely. You know, we learn so much through not just our words. It's really helpful. The 100 Languages poem is really inspirational if you haven't heard it before. Yeah, so I mentioned the book, the Anna F. Grave books. There are different ones. I will think the links in the books there. If you type in Anna F. Grave in the Moment training, they'll come up on Amazon. Helicopter Stories. Again, if you type in Helicopter Stories, Early Years Learning, the book comes up. I'm sorry, I don't have the name of the book on hand. But again, Helicopter Stories, if you just look at it online, you can read quite a lot for free on blogs as well. The difference between play-based learning and inquiry-based learning, I think I've spoken a little bit about having provocations and invitations. When you have those provocations and invitations, you're moving towards more inquiry-based and you've sort of got a goal or a target. And with our Year 1 pupils, we're really sort of moving more in that inquiry-based direction. And being an international school with lots of specialists that we've spoken about, we definitely are more on that inquiry based because time is more limited. Whereas play-based learning, for me, in my definition, is really more about allowing for those free play moments. I don't have an agenda. The children have the agenda. And I think that's kind of where I draw a difference, but you'll read different things and have different understandings from different people. Someone here said, would you recommend replacing STEAM STEM with play-based learning for kindergarten? So I think that comes a lot down to the continuous provision and the environments that you have in place. So, you know, it's really good to look at your continuous provision and think, have I got opportunities for STEAM to take place? And you know, again, you're learning, the children can learn as their earliest opportunities through that. And you may set up, there's so many opportunities for invitations that will be STEAM based, and there's brilliant ones online you can do. The gingerbread man, the children always end up, you know, being fascinated by the gingerbread man. It's a really good, lovely story to read. But I think it's just about ensuring that it's not all you have. If all of your opportunities with the children are invitations, then you're just not allowing that free play. But there's no reason to not have that available. And equally, if you don't have any STEAM-based materials for their play, they're not going to learn those things. So one of the things that we did when we were setting up, when I worked in Brighton College in the Middle East, was we looked at what was in our continuous provision. So we made sure that all of the children had access to magnets. We made sure there was always balanced scales. We made sure that they always had opportunities to mix paint independently, that we always had ice available so they could explore mixing ice and salt and water and all these different things that will encourage STEAM-based learning. If you don't have those resources available, then you need to teach them about those things. But if you have the resources available for play, then you're going to allow the children to learn about those things for themselves. Yeah, so a really good question there about the climate in Thailand. I think the key is to have your door open, so the children can be coming in and outside from the climate and the pollution and things. So wherever possible, have that outside area open, and they can be coming inside for the aircon and outside to play. Keep an eye on the weather, and you might have to limit the amount of time they're outside, which we don't want to do, but make sure they've got lots of water available. Make sure they wear hats if they're out in the sun, and just encourage that there's that free flow as much as possible. What I've found, particularly with reception age children, is actually if they get hot, they go inside. So, you know, if you it's almost harder when you have to stop them and take them outside. Whereas if you have those opportunities for free flow, then that really does help. The big difference that I found here was actually the pollution was the thing that made things a little bit more difficult, because you can't allow that. Rain, I don't have an issue with. Get your, you know, go out and get wet, get appropriate clothing, wear hats, have spare clothes in school, always have spare clothes. But children love the rain, splashing puddles, obviously lightning, don't go outside. But you do have to be mindful of it, but you just take advantage wherever you can. One of the differences that I found, particularly with forest schools, and I'm still learning about if anyone has any top tips, was snakes. So lots of the things I shared about for the desert learning that we did in Al Ain, that was where I had to be more mindful, was obviously I couldn't quite encourage the children to dig through bushes in the same way that I used to be. So, you know, there are some things you have to really risk assess. So how frequently do you think a nursery team should meet to review continuous provision? So daily for your interactions, you know, meeting every day just to talk about what you had that day and any enhancements that you want to make quickly. Really, ideally, it's a 5-minute chat every day. It's even a 5-minute chat when you're observing the children. Oh, look, no one's over there. And, you know, being prepared to do that and not worry about other people and what they're thinking. If you're talking about professional things with the children, I think is really important to constantly be doing that. But actually those bigger picture continuous provision, we have something on our calendar now every 6 weeks, so every half term, called the Big Meet. And for our Key Stage 1 and Key Stage 2, they'll be looking at the bigger topics and how to hook the children in and where play-based opportunities can be. And for early years, it's all about the continuous provision. So that's when they meet every 6 weeks. Let's look at it, what needs evaluating, and also then maybe what we can purchase. And how frequently should enhancements be made? I think specifically for nursery, you enhance when the children aren't really using it. You know, if they're using it frequently, then you enhance to, you don't really need to enhance it, except for possibly if you think it can move the learning forward. So in our kitchen that I shared, you saw the children in there, we added some cookbooks because we thought it might encourage the children to add a bit more language to their play. And then we played and picked up books and pretended to cook. So, you know, just if you think it can move the learning forward, but it doesn't need to be all the time. I think I've caught most of the questions, and I realise I've run majorly over, but because they were there, I wanted to answer them. So those of you that stayed, I hope it's been helpful.